record. All right. Welcome to the AIRA talks. Just give me a second. Let me spotlight. Yes. Welcome to the AIRA talks, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Adeboro Odunlami. I am the coordinator of the African Internet Rights Alliance. AIRA is an alliance of 10 civil society organizations that work on digital rights and internet freedoms on the African continent. We envision an Africa where digital rights are upheld in every aspect of life. And AIRA Talks is really just our platform where we gather stakeholders, policymakers, civil society leaders as yourself, representatives of various organizations, and just even individuals who are interested in digital rights to collaborate, to share their experiences, to learn together. So think of it as a learning call. This is the first AIRA Talks of the year. We hold one every quarter. I will put the link when I'm done. I'll put the link to our previous AIRA talks so you can go watch everything we've done from climate change to education to different exciting topics. So you can go catch up on that. I also want to invite you to follow AIRA on LinkedIn and visit our website as well. I'll share the link in the chat. I'll share the link in the chat box very soon. Today, our topic is platform accountability and AI technologies in times of war. We're going to be sharing an African perspective to digital platforms and artificial intelligence technologies and the role that they play in conflict zones. I think many times the conversation around this is around global conflict, but we want to get a very, very home perspective and a perspective from the continent. And with me, I'm just the moderator. We actually have Angela Minaya as moderator, and she'll be joining in. She has had some difficulty joining. So when she joins, she'll just take over from me. But I have experts here in the room. I've got Lillian Washira, we've got Arsene Tungali, and we've got Chantel Juris. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, one or two lines, say, what they're looking forward to the most and what they do, and then we'll kick start it. So Lillian, permit me to start with you.
Certainly. Thank you, Adeboro. My name is Lillian Washira. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. I'm based in Nairobi. So I cover international humanitarian law. This is my area of specialization. And the thing I'm looking forward to the most is the African perspective part. This is always interesting. So thank you for convening this platform.
Thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to hearing from your wealth of knowledge. Arsene, can I invite you next?
Sure. Thanks, Adebo. Thanks, everyone. My name is Arsene Tungali, calling in, joining from Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I head the work with Root International, which is a non-profit working at the intersection of technology and human rights. So our work is focused on capacity building, research and advocacy, and I'm really happy to be joining this session today, discussing about different topics. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Arsene. We're also looking forward to hearing from you and learning from your wealth of experience. And Chantel, please permit me to invite you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for those joining and giving us time for the discussion on a Friday. My name is Chantal Joris. I'm a senior legal officer with Article 19. We're an internationally active freedom of expression organization. And my work specifically has focused mainly on platform accountability, platform regulation, and freedom of expression in armed conflicts. I'm excited about the discussion today because I do believe there will be a focus on a perspective that is not often enough heard when we talk about platform accountability in conflict zones. So I think there will be new ideas and observations emerging that are perhaps less prominent in these discussions. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's what I'm looking forward to as well. We've got Angela with us. She has joined in. I think the network is better. Angela, Is everything better now? Are you free to take over? All right. I'm going to remove my own spotlight because who am I?
Okay.
And
I
I'm going
think,
to,
yes.
perfect.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Minayo. I work at Article 19 Eastern Africa as the Digital Rights and Policy Programs Officer. I coordinate the Africa Internet Rights Alliance together with Adeboro, and I'm happy to introduce today's webinar and moderate the panel. So if we are ready, Adeboro, we can go to the session.
Absolutely, we're ready. You can go ahead.
All right, thank you. So just to set the context, we know that Africa has at least 35 active conflicts and humanitarian situations. And we were wondering what could be the role of tech companies and what is the role that AI is playing in how these conflicts are morphing, how these conflicts are financed, and how information in ecosystems during armed conflicts needs to be well regulated, and how we need to make sure that freedom of expression is still enhanced and ensured even during these situations of armed conflict. And of course, my first question will be to Lilian. Lilian, you work with the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross. And my question to you will be, what are the key humanitarian risks associated with AI-powered surveillance and automated decision-making in conflict-affected regions? Lilian, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Angela. So I think before I start, it's just important, Angela, if you allow me, that I appreciate the fact and in terms of how AI is deployed in crisis settings, including in armed conflict. For example, at the ICRC, we're using AI for logistics optimization, of course, without the data of affected people. And other organizations are also using AI, for example, to predict epidemic, search efforts in emergency. So there is a lot of promise there, but there is also risks. Also, it is not just humanitarian organizations that are exploring the potential of AI in armed conflict. It is also parties to conflict. And it's also that civilians are also using AI in armed conflict. I'm sure if I were to ask just now whether you've used AI in your personal lives, I'm sure several hands will go up, whether it's ChatGPT or I don't know, navigation systems or any of these things. So the risks that exist when we use AI outside of conflict are even exacerbated during armed conflict because of the existing vulnerabilities that conflict places on civilians affected by conflict. And so this is what I would like to discuss. And they can come from a number of places. Like I said, it could be as a result of humanitarians using AI for their processes, or militaries result of AI in decision support systems and all of this. So when we talk about AI, I think one of the more common phrases you will hear is that there is no AI without data, right? Which is something we talk about when you're referring to the fact that AI systems are dependent upon vast amounts of training data, and the quality of this system is therefore directly related to the quality of the data. In other words, like the intelligence of AI is derived from the data that the model has been trained on. So in conflict zones, I say this poses a number of risks. The first one which could arise from incomplete or unrepresentative data. And I say this because in areas of armed conflict, it can be difficult or challenging to collect data or representative data for a number of reasons, one of which is that it could be that there are certain regions that are inaccessible, for example, to humanitarians due to security concerns, or access has not been granted by parties to the conflict. So if we're relying on models that have been trained on data that is unrepresentative or incomplete or outdated, then this will also be replicated in the outcomes, which will lead to flawed outcomes. And the risk here is that we are risking marginalizing already marginalized community, or communities that are already facing difficulties as a result of the conflict, and we're putting them at further risk. And this could be as a result of biases as well in the training data, and the biases could be as a result of historical, societal biases in the data, which means that if the data used for training contains discriminatory patterns, then these biases will again be perpetuated in the AI's decision making. And this is problematic, again, especially for protection activities in conflict and for humanitarian assistance, because it will lead, or it can lead humanitarians to inadvertently ignore or not pay as particular attention to communities or individuals that are already marginalized. And of course, this could also interfere with the principle of impartiality, which is a core principle that humanitarian organizations working in conflict rely on. If, again, the data is biased, it might mean that, whoever ends up receiving critical aid, it's not decided on the basis of impartiality. But there is also the lack of, or a disconnect between the design phase and the ultimate application of, or the phase where the AI tool is applied. And by this, I mean, sometimes I understand it's a lack of knowledge of the context, especially when you have a lot of these systems being designed by developers in the global north who do not have, good understanding of the context where these AI systems or tools will be deployed, say, for example, in Africa. And so this lack of context can materialize, or rather lack of a knowledge of the context is going to, materialize ultimately when the tool is deployed. For example, imagine a tool that is developed without taking into account the unique political, ethnic, or cultural, religious sensitivities of a country. And I also see these also risk related to a lack of putting communities at the center, or giving them agency, making sure that humanitarian action is participatory. And this is particularly so when AI systems are being deployed or used to predict or anticipate need. We risk not putting crisis-affected populations at the center. But at the same time, Angela, you mentioned risk associated with digital, or say AI-powered surveillance or monitoring and intrusion. And this I see can come from various places. For example, it could be misuse of data by parties to a conflict. It could even be as a result of, or as a consequence of civilians' own presence or their activities online. And then you have AI systems that reveal really, say, sensitive information or insight into a person's political affiliations or their whereabouts, even, based on things such as cell site location data. And once this data is collected, it's highly susceptible to misuse, and it can cause affected it can, result into affected communities or populations being subjected to potential harm offline, risk of violence, or being surveilled and profiled. But the risk of surveillance also occurs as a result of by humanitarian organizations themselves, when we collect data in order to respond to needs. And I give an example here, for example, drone usage to map, to assess how to respond or similar issues. Now, while these might not necessarily contain personally identifiable data, such footage may then, gather information from context where people live and without their consent and knowledge, and this, can still expose them to risks. I think I said that, militaries are also, running out of time, but if I could just mention one thing relating to military application and say that, you see, the same biases we're talking about have also, or can also be replicated when AI is deployed, or for AI-based decision support systems for military operations. And for example, it may cause automated target recognition systems to misclassify certain individuals or groups as legitimate targets. And we've seen this play out in real life, maybe not here in Africa, but we've seen it play when an individual is identified as a legitimate target based on their apparent affiliation with certain tribes. And of course, this in armed conflict will have fatal consequences. And then there is the questions, related to automation bias or over-reliance on
Invasion of one's territory, etc. And so Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, WhatsApp are really being heavily used on both sides in that regard. Now, you can imagine the level of fake news, of disinformation, of misinformation that should be spreading across those platforms about the real reasons of this conflict or even its drivers. There are now conflicting numbers, conflicting interpretations, conflicting reasoning, opening up the gate for fake news, for hate speech, or incitement to violence through the words that will be coming from both parts. And so someone from outside the conflict will somehow get confused because the digital armies are really operating. And for that to be successful, both, I would say on both sides, users will now create fake accounts, which will be operating like robots. And the role of these will be just to be there, to be constant. What's going on in the digital space from the, and so AI also used somehow in as well, generating facts that prove to be wrong, and contributing to the spread of misinformation and disinformation in the real. As you know, most of these AI platforms are being fed up by these very same controversies that are present on all these platforms. And early this year, in January, when the conflict was really heavy in the Goma and Bukavu regions in the eastern part of the country, as a response, unfortunately, the DRC government, my government, had to shut down the internet again, which they last did back in 2019. It was like, I would say, 5 or 6 years without any internet disruptions, backed by the government. But as a result of what's going on in the digital ecosystem in the region, the government had to resort to shutting down the internet and blocking some platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, and TikTok, maybe because they thought this platform were not doing a great job in moderating their own platforms or moderating the content. And for some of these platforms, the blockage was took a few hours, for others, a few days, and this has led clearly to the violation of people's rights and preventing people from accurately accessing accurate information about what's going on in the country. The DRC is really known as having the all those strategic minerals that are driving the technology economy in the world. And that's why in my in these initial statements, I was saying that I believe the whole conflict going on in the region is related to minerals, strategic minerals that are being used to create technology and to create all those infrastructures that, from laptops to mobile phones to fiber cables to to all those technologies that people are using. And so I think as initial thoughts, Angela, this is what I can say in terms of how digital platforms are being used and how these are really impacting or influencing the conflict dynamics, especially in misinformation and online incitement to violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hassan, you have at least enlightened us on the fact that there are digital armies by both parties to the conflict who disseminate skewed narratives around the conflict. I think this is something most of the people even on the call can admit, that understanding the DRC conflict is very hard because of the misinformation and disinformation that is on social media. So it's really hard to get accurate information. At the same time, I think it's important to talk about the role of tech in this conflict. The fact that the minerals powering tech like cobalt are in the DRC, and also that armies are fighting to get control of these minerals because it means they can trade and they can get enough money to continue financing the conflict. So tech is complicit also in that aspect. I will go to Chantal from Article 19. We have had a lot about freedom of expression, a lot about access to information. My question to you is, what are the legal and policy challenges that advocates for free expression like Article 19 face, especially in ensuring accountability for AI-driven misinformation and hate speech in African conflict zones? Chantal, you can switch on your camera. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Angela. I have, you can see me, right?
Yes.
The camera is on. Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that. I mean, I think generally speaking, as freedom of expression advocates, it can be a challenging space because we recognize that so much of, again, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, however it might be named, can have very negative impact on the protection of civilians, on conflict dynamics. But we also always need to make sure to advocate for responses that are also in line with human rights standards that keep protecting freedom of expression, and to emphasize that, again, access to online platforms. We've just heard the example that Arsene mentioned, where a shutdown was, at least I understand, justified also by the circulation of problematic content through these digital armies. That any responses are also necessary and proportionate on a legal basis, and continue to protect freedom of expression. I think when it's about ensuring accountability for disseminating or for the presence of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech in conflict zones, I think there's two aspects to look at. On the one hand, the actors that are behind the dissemination of that type of content, where we have certain precedents. For example, international criminal law, we have the media case in the Rwandan genocide context that was about the radio inciting genocide, and there is some precedent for prosecutions happening. Of course, the way that these cases present themselves today are often far more complex, right? Because we just heard that there can be fake accounts, so questions of attribution become much more complicated. Who is actually behind the dissemination of the information? Often also the type of information. Again, it might be to create a certain narrative. It might not be sort of direct incitement to a direct specific crime that might then be committed. So also the link between certain content and offline violence or a specific crime having been committed offline can be a bit more difficult to establish. And in terms of at least legal accountability, litigation, criminal accountability, that can pose certain challenges. Having said that, I do think that again the link between these nefarious actions in the information space, in the online information space as well, and what impact they have on conflict zones is increasingly recognized. And at the moment, for example, the International Criminal Court has just published a draft policy on cyber-enabled international crime. So they have articulated an intention to look at this increasingly, which includes also the role of disinformation and incitement. So again, I feel like it's still early days in us understanding it and finding ways to ensure accountability for those actions. But this work is happening. And similarly, when it comes to tech accountability, sort of it's the same challenges that they're faced with the additional challenge of are there existing, and this is something I know we will discuss a bit later in the discussion, are there existing regulatory frameworks in place that allow also for any legal accountability of tech companies and how they might contribute to the problem, exacerbate the problem, or not having done enough to limit the potential harmful effect of the content that is circulating on their platforms. And we've seen certain litigations happening. Kenya is an interesting. They have a specific constitution. Angela, you will be able to comment on that as well, of course. Where essentially the constitution also contains human rights obligations or fundamental rights obligations for also private entities. This is quite rare. So in other jurisdictions, you might have to resort to other legal bases, which are not so directly linked to human rights obligations of tech companies. And at the international level, of course, you have more like soft law instruments like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So I think, again, one of the challenges is really to find a legal basis that can be invoked, and then the same, right? Like, how can we prove that the action of a platform has, or the inaction of a platform has maybe led to certain offline harm that can be then invoked in courts. And this has been tested also in a number of jurisdictions, also outside the conflict zone. So over the case of Myanmar, we've seen cases filed in the UK and the US, also around sort of recruitment of ISIS on online platforms. We've seen cases filed in the US. So as far as I'm aware, none of these litigations have yet been successful. But again, it's quite early days, I think. These test cases will continue to be brought. The legal arguments will be refined, and the courts will have to grapple increasingly with this question. And perhaps just as a last point, I think it's not so different. Arsène brought the topic of the use of minerals, right, in empowering the technologies. And I also know there in the US, there has been a litigation brought against, I believe it was Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, some of these sort of end users. And Apple, yes, some of these not the end user will be the consumers, but the companies that sell products, right, and that use use these minerals. They are also, as far as I understand, courts have held that the supply chain is too long, the link is too tenuous, the causation cannot be established. So in a sense, some very distinct challenges, but also some of the similar challenges of how can we prove the causation, how can we prove the harm in a way that accountability is really possible. But as I said, also there, I think early days, I think this is something worth pursuing and worth getting right. Again, as freedom of expression advocates, we're always careful about how exactly a certain claim might be formulated to not result in strict liability for any content that platforms host. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal. And maybe just to add on the Kenyan constitution, our constitution recognizes horizontal application of human rights. So the Bill of Rights binds both state and non-state actors, and that's why it is relatively easier to bring public interest litigation against companies for human rights violations in our country. But this is not unique to Kenya alone. The Kenyan constitution borrowed heavily from the South Africa constitution. So I think in terms of the jurisdiction to look out for possible litigation on tech and human rights will be South Africa and Kenya because of the horizontal application of human rights in both constitutions. It's interesting that you've raised the cases that have been brought against tech companies, I believe in the US and in France. The case in the US was for child labor and the deaths that are resulted from child labor in mining. The case in France is a bit interesting because it was brought under the OECD guidelines on minerals and, just a guideline for companies to make sure that they do not finance conflicts implicitly through trade. So they trade in certain minerals, cobalt being one of them, because these are minerals that are found in conflict zones. Just wanted to add that. Thank you so much, Chantal. Also, just to give a summary of what you have shared, it is quite hard to show the link between offline harms and platforms' actions, but that does not mean that it's not possible. I think these cases against tech platforms are a brave stance from civil society and public interest actors who are seeing the links. And I think the role of courts is now more than ever to help us determine what are the parameters and what are the criteria for establishing these violations and attaching accountability or attributing accountability to platforms. Thank you so much, Chantal. I will go to Lillian. We are really talking about conflicts and armed conflict, and this is an area that ICRC has worked on a lot. And while my question was to ask you about regulation of AI, of the opportunities for use of AI, I feel like it will be more beneficial for this webinar if you could share also what are the regulatory norms and frameworks that you are seeing in terms of establishing some form of norm setting and standards on how AI technologies are going to be applied in conflicts. Are the old rules still applicable? Are there new rules that are coming up to address AI and emerging technologies in conflict? Sorry
Angela,
for throwing you under the bus.
No, it's okay. And it's funny you should ask that because I have a colleague who is very fond of saying that there is no lawless situation in armed conflict, which she says this to mean that, even if the Geneva Conventions were codified almost 76 years ago now, that there's still, enough in the law that can continue, or at least enough to continue, ensuring humanity during armed conflicts. And I for one like this kind of optimism. But I think there is still more that needs to be done, especially when it comes to AI in military application, in the decision support systems. But I would say even as IHL exists today, it is still possible, to regulate warfare conducted through these means. And I say this because, for example, when we come to IHL compliance, a party to a conflict that chooses to use AI in decision support systems must be ready and willing to respect IHL in the first place. Otherwise, the risk is that these tools will exacerbate unlawful behavior faster and on a larger scale. At the same time, when IHL when these IHL treaties were being negotiated all those years ago, they were negotiated with humans in mind. It is humans who must respect IHL, and it is humans who remain accountable, whatever technologies they might use. So for the ICRC, there's also we consider that there should be a human, or that decision makers need to be aware of AI's limitations. We spoke a little bit about this earlier, but it's also important that we are not too heavily reliant on machines, that there is a human decision maker on the scale. And for example, I say this because there's what is called like a bias to, or a heavy automation bias, which speaks to a heavy reliance on technology, whereby human beings, in situations such as where we are deploying artificial intelligence in military or in warfare, the human kind of takes a back seat and basically just rubber stamps the recommendations of the machine. Well, this should not be the case, because we need to have a human in the loop. Again, because it's important. It's also questions of attribution. I know Chantal spoke about this earlier, but it applies as well in human AI interactions when it comes to AI decision support systems and the use of force. So I would say the law as it exists, IHL, as it currently exists, there is still room for more to be developed, but it doesn't mean that as states are now, or militaries are now deploying AI technologies in conflict, they're doing so in a vacuum. In any case, you have IHL obligations which demand that states, whenever they deploy new technologies, ensure that those technologies are compliant with international humanitarian law. And specifically, I'm thinking about Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1. But also at the same time, and especially when we're talking about digital platforms and social media channels and all of this, I would say there exist, for example, already prohibitions, as for example, the prohibition against encouraging IHL violations already exists in IHL as at the moment, which means this obligation requires that whether it is civilian or military leadership of a party to a conflict, they must not encourage IHL IHL violations by their own forces, and at the same time by other groups which the state might be in control of, which means as a result of this, it's that using digital platforms to encourage, say, violence against civilians, or violence against civilian objects, and other prohibited prohibited conduct of warfare in IHL is prohibited. But I certainly do say, there is still more that can be done.
Thank you. I asked this because I also believe that the laws are quite outdated. You're looking at, decades of application of IHL laws as we've known them, and then a technology shift that's making us question the applicability of the rules themselves. Thank you for admitting that there needs to be more needs to be done in terms of addressing deployment of AI technologies and really looking at the laws of war in this new digital world that we live in. You've also cautioned on the over-reliance on automation. I think as someone who is in this continent, we know that automation and digitalization is peddled as this solution to everything, but it's good to take a step back and rethink how we're going to be using these automated technologies. Thank you so much, Lillian. I will go to Chantal. There's been a lot of questions around self-regulation mechanisms at the platform level. And my question is, are these self-regulating mechanisms meaningful in terms of accountability of platforms in conflict-affected regions? If the answer to this question is no, are you advocating, or is Article 19 advocating for stronger external regulations needed? Chantal, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Angela. If I can just also very briefly follow up on the discussion about whether IHL rules are still sort of fit for purpose. I think on the one hand, for those interested, you might be interested to looking at the state positions that have been published on how they view international law to apply in cyberspace, and where they formulate certain aspects around what they consider to be like an attack that needs to be abiding by the principles of distinction and proportionality and so on, and many other questions. And I think on the one hand, through the fact that ICT technologies are so important nowadays for civilians, they're so everywhere in modern life, and also during conflict, principles of proportionality, humanity, etc., can find themselves applicable in this context, and we find would also limit actions like internet shutdowns and so on. So as Lillian mentioned, they still continue to apply and be relevant. And I also think, while I agree, definitely certain additional rules would be desirable in specific contexts. There is always the risk that the rules that are negotiated by states might not look the way we would want them to look, right? So when we say we want additional rules, we always think additional better rules, right? That will be more protective, but that is not necessarily always the outcome that we can expect from state negotiations. But to come to your question, Angela, I mean, when it comes to the self-regulatory mechanisms in particular, particularly prominent, obviously the oversight board of Meta, I would say the short answer is no. I don't think it's either sufficient or that it made a meaningful difference from my perspective when it comes to content moderation or the role of social media companies, I should say, in conflict zones. I mean, the Oversight Board has published a number of interesting decisions, I would say, around, doesn't mean that I always agree with their decision or their reasoning, but I would say they're well reasoned, and try to bring a certain nuance into how content moderation can work in specific cases and conflict zones. So they've published decisions on Ethiopia, Sudan, also outside Africa on the war on Gaza, Russia, Ukraine, and so on. The thing is just it's very limited to the question of content moderation and looking at certain sort of specifically very complex example, which again is an interesting read. Sometimes they're sort of advisory, sort of the recommendations they make to Meta, which Meta does not necessarily have to follow, are also, of course, of broader relevance and broader application, but it's still very limited, again, to just how should a platform moderate certain complex content, rather than looking at the platform's recommend resources allocated to content moderation, the data collection practices, and so on, how they engage with stakeholders on the ground, with humanitarian actors. So those sort of much more broader systemic questions are not necessarily at the center of what the oversight board does, right? And so do we need stronger external regulation? Probably yes. The reality is also that we've seen many jurisdictions come up with regulations, working on regulations, adopting regulations recently, to seek to hold platforms accountable, or let's say that's the intended and sometimes sort of it's the declared and maybe sometimes the actual intended purpose. The problem is that often these regulations, as Article 19, we are quite critical of them because we think that they lead rather to more sort of state control over the internet generally, try to give more state leverage over platforms, and sort of incentivize platforms to avoid fines or to avoid advertising bans or to avoid sort of a shutdown, to maybe over remove content, sometimes content that is critical of the government. So often these regulations are, again, very content focused, not so much focused on how the platforms make money, how they recommend content, and sort of how they contribute to the problems in the information ecosystem themselves. So on the one hand, there are rules that we think are more useful, centered around transparency, user rights, maybe data access for researchers, sort of systemic risk assessments. We will find those rules more useful than rules around saying, you need to screen all your content for like disinformation and remove disinformation. That is one thing. So there are certain regulations that we will be more in favor of than others. And then there is also the reality that a rule might work well in a specific jurisdiction, whether it's because they have data protection laws in place or because they have a strong independent court system. But we might be a bit more hesitant seeing the same rule, legislation, regulation applied in other contexts, right? Because the risk of arbitrary enforcement and sort of nefarious applications of those rules in a way that undermines human rights is more prevalent. So I think just to say that there's no yes or no answer, I would say, to should we have stronger external regulation. I think it's very context dependent. And from a sort of civil society perspective, I think it's extremely important that local civil society actors that know their government very well, that know the problems very well, are sort of closely involved in any advocacy by, say, international organizations or be it non-governmental organizations or governmental organizations that might try to advocate for certain rules. Perhaps very briefly, I think I'm out of time. So just also to mention that regulators outside the conflict zones can also have an impact potentially on the flow of information in the conflict zone. In the European Union, the Digital Services Act has been adopted relatively recently, and we've had conversations about what the impact of the Digital Services Act can be on, for example, crime documentation, evidence of human rights violations, or even freedom of expression in conflict zones, either adjacent to the European Union, but also be it in the DRC, be it in Sudan, because a platform might globally take down content that sort of doesn't comply with the Digital Services Act, or certain accountability mechanisms sit in the EU. Any obligation to archive evidence on the platforms in the EU, again, could impact the ability to investigate what's happening in conflict zones. So just to highlight also the roles of states and regulators outside the conflict zone, given the global nature of the internet. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Chantal. You have answered the question as any civil society advocate by saying that it's not a straight answer. While self-regulation might look like something that is more easy to sell to platforms, we have seen how self-regulation has failed We have seen also that even platforms' internal mechanisms like the oversight board still fall short of truly changing how platforms operate from a business model point of view, from a content policies point of view. You have also warned us or cautioned us against external regulation, because while we might look at it as a way to form standards for tech accountability, governments see this as an opportunity to regulate content. They see this as an extension of their jurisdiction to remove content, to ask platforms to remove content, or to even incentivize platforms to remove content more, where, for instance, their licenses or other administrative actions that are done by the government on a regular basis, which can be used to coerce governments. It's interesting you've raised how the DSA has, changed how platforms are held accountable, even for jurisdiction outside the EU. And I would say the same for Kenya, because our constitution was a bit more friendly. A case concerning an Ethiopian conflict is being heard in Kenyan courts, which is quite interesting. Also, of course, jurisdiction was stretched from the fact that some of the content moderation is done in Kenya. So maybe moving forward, we might want to also look at where content moderation is being done. Just anything to learn from the Meta case. I want to go to Asen. You have a question in the chat, but I'll ask you that during the plenary. My question to you is, what opportunities do you see for African digital rights advocates in engaging with global tech companies to push for stronger accountability? Asen, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Angela, I have to admit the conversation has been going on very well. Thanks, Lilian and Chantal, for the insight, and I'm sure the people who are following will also be asking questions. I think advocacy opportunities are there, and I think tech companies have responsibility in making sure first, and we need to start pushing for that, or still pushing for that, is civil society or digital rights advocates for content moderation capabilities. I think these platforms are seeing rapid numbers of users, and they also have to be able to increase, their some of their capabilities to moderate some of the content when they feel these are violating their community standards. I don't think it makes any sense if they claim that they're not able to read some languages and therefore tolerate the violence that is being spread using those local or natural languages in the African community. I also have to say that TikTok is growing numbers in the DRC, but I also have to say that the level of moderation, content moderation, is still very weak on that platform from TikTok. And users are now using that opportunity to do whatever they want. And unfortunately, in a situation of conflict like in the DRC, some of the content you see on platforms such as TikTok are only contributing to inciting people for more violence, but also spreading misinformation and fake news, and this is somehow, and it starts to be saying that maybe that's one of the reasons that the government is feeling obliged somehow to answer and start not moderating, but now blocking access to some of these platforms. I believe these platforms need to educate users by partnering with civil society organizations on the ground in providing trainings on their community standards is a way to sensitize their users on what are the best practices that they need to adopt when they are using these platforms. That's what I was saying. I believe these platforms need to invest in capacity building in various regions of African content, and digital rights advocates need to also push for that, for more activities where these platforms are coming down on the continent and raising awareness about their standards, and I think this can help reduce somehow some of those bad content being spread on social media. And of course, these platforms need as a citizen of the DRC, and I think I also have to remind them of their responsibility of making sure they don't contribute to the conflicts in the region by making sure they source the materials or the minerals such as the cobalt that is fueling technology from reliable sources, not using those conflict-related traders from whom they can happen to be buying their minerals. I believe civil society organizations should continue advocating on other areas, encouraging those platforms to publish their transparency reports very regularly, making sure we know as advocates what kind of requests they're receiving from our government, especially some requests on content takedowns or some other forms of requests government are sending to them. I think it's important that they continue disclosing the transparency reports that will help us know what kind of behavior our governments are trying to do when they are reaching out to them. And this is something as civil society digital rights advocate, I believe we need to keep on pushing for these platforms. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you so much, Asem. I see we're on time. We're doing well with time, not so bad. Just please stay on call because I have one question for you. And the question is, what strategies has civil society developed in Republic Democratic RDC to be able to counter the use of digital armies? You spoke about the fact that both parties seem to have digital armies. What is civil society doing in DRC? How are you trying to mitigate the risk of misinformation and disinformation?
I think I don't think there is a way to prevent those digital armies of being formed or being deployed, because this is one of the strategies. You know, when there is conflict and citizens are facing, you know, the consequences of these conflicts on their own bodies, we are facing the consequences of this conflict. And so citizens at some point they're asking themselves, we are not the government, we are not the army, so we can't go on the field and be fighting. But all we can do is using social media and using the internet as a way to I don't know to speak up against what's going on, or to send positive messages encouraging our government, because the digital armies are not only doing bad things. We also see digital campaigns being run by the Ministry of Communications in the DRC as a way to make citizens post messages encouraging our fighters, our soldiers in the army, which are fighting on the battlefield. These are some of the messages that are also being spread out by what we call the digital armies, which can be considered as a positive sign. But now on the other side, people are trying to do whatever they can, but since they lack also maybe proper training, they lack proper sensitization, they found themselves being involved in now the spread of misinformation. A civil society or organization, what we are doing is with international is also making sure we give training on the use of social media platforms, also on the use of fake, or the danger of using fake news and misinformation, because sometimes these people may think they are doing the right thing in supporting the government effort, but they are only doing the opposite by spreading misinformation and fake news, because this is not healthy anyway. And so I believe what we are doing as a country is, a civil society organization, is to train people on what are fake news, on what is misinformation, what is disinformation, and encourage them to understand that spreading misinformation is not a way of supporting the government or the country in the ongoing conflict, but it's rather the opposite. So you would rather disseminate the truth, you would rather disseminate facts, you'd rather disseminate the actual or the reality of what's going on, rather than, some people just, and I can say this, because they have to show on social media the level of damages that's being caused by those rebel groups. They sometimes, and we've seen this using AI, fake images, or they make up false images or false videos, just to grow in terms of numbers of the damage that is being caused. Or on the other side of the opponents, they are also using AI and some other tools to cover up some of the consequences of the conflict that is happening. And so I think I've answered to this question somehow. I don't think there's a way to completely get away of these armies, but educate these armies on so that they can use social media and internet for the good rather than using them for the bad. No, I meant they are not just doing doing the negative role in nourishing the hostile or hostilities. No, there's some positive side, because also, as I said, this conflict in the DRC is also somehow social. That's why people need to be educated on the history, on the history of the ethnic groups, the history of the conflict, so that they understand what are the stakes, what are the origins of the conflict, where they came from. And to social media and these armies are also doing positive things in educating people on the accurate information, so that when we'll be having a lot of accurate information being spread out on social media, other people will be picking up on that, and we'll have a community that is well educated on what's going on really on the ground. So it's positive, but also negative.
Thank you for making that clarification, Yasin. Ayman, would you want to engage on this further? I fully agree. Okay, fine.
Thanks, Angela. It was clear. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Let me see if we have any other question. This could be a useful study in how governments combat misinformation without resorting to censorship. This is from Naro Omo. He has written this on the chat. Maybe just to wrap up, if there are no other questions in the chat, is to invite all panelists to share with us their key takeaway. What is the one concluding point that if we don't get anything from this webinar, we should remember regarding platform accountability in conflict situations? So I will start with Lillian, and then Chantal, and then finally Asen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again, Angela. I think for me, the key takeaway, again, I will still resort to IHL and to say that especially for humanitarians and as well as for parties to armed conflict, it is critical to ensure that we do not cause civilian harm as a result of our activities. And by this, I mean wider than just, related to activities. I mean, even in terms of what Chantal was speaking about earlier, which is regarding to questions of attribution vis-a-vis censorship. And so for me, it's important to always remember that there is someone on the other side, and that person is almost certainly a civilian, and we have to have in mind the effect of the decisions that we are taking and the technologies that we're deploying in mind.
Thank you, Lillian. Chantal?
Thank you. I mean, for me, primarily was also really super interesting to get more detail about like the dynamics in the DRC. And again, I think it's a perfect example. Also, the discussion around digital armies. When you hear the term, you think, oh, I'm sure it's bad, but how also they can be a a useful tool also with the internet shutdowns is, it can sometimes be complicated how to navigate the right responses to harmful information. So I think, on the one hand, really, again, a reminder that in particular, when you come as an actor from sort of outside the conflict zone, any demands you place on online platforms or any strategies you think you want to advocate for really needs to be based on a thorough understanding of the problems on the ground and in the specific context. And at the same time, however, how learning from other experiences from, say, actors in other conflicts, how they can look at, again, here it was mentioned that it can be a useful example on how to combat misinformation without resorting to censorship, how we can learn from the different examples, because there are certain common trends across conflicts, I would say, for sure, whilst, however, at the same time understanding that all of them have their unique features and unique challenges.
Thank you so much, Chantal. Finally, Asen.
Thank you. And I think I have to agree with Naro that I think as civil society organizations, we also need to start thinking, if not already, on how the government, on how we can help the government understand that they can combat misinformation without resorting to censorship, because in most cases this has happened in the DRC. For the number of internet shutdowns that we've had, most of the times they are somehow justified by the government because of misinformation, spread of fake news, when they feel that they don't have control on the way people are behaving on social media. So they would just do the radical way of shutting down. And sometimes it's not just censoring the content, but blocking or shutting down internet totally. So I think this was a great conversation. Thanks everyone for participating and for sharing your own insights. And I agree that the digital army thing happening in the region here. I think we need a civil society continue educating people on how they can best use technology and making sure they use it positively, rather than using it to spearhead or to spread misinformation or any kind of bad behaviors. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Asen. You have given us so much impact and highlights into the DRC conflict, and we thank you so much for that. And we know that this is a difficult time, and thank you for making the time, and we stand in solidarity with DRC. I think the digital rights community in Africa can do more, and I hope that this webinar is just one of the ways we can shed light on the tech accountability issues in the DRC, and we look forward to working with you on this. We'll also want to thank all the other panelists, Chantal from Article 19 and Lillian from ICRC. You have given us invaluable expertise into tech accountability in conflicts, the use of AI technologies in conflict, which is a very technical subject matter. But I truly, truly believe that this webinar has gone a long way in clarifying what tech accountability looks like in situations of conflict. I would like to thank also the participants who made time on a Friday afternoon where I am. I don't know what time it is in your time zones, but thank you so much for joining our panel. This recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. You just go to YouTube and write AIRA. You'll get our YouTube channel. We're also on LinkedIn and X, which was formerly Twitter. Follow us, follow our work. Keep up with the webinars that we have every month. And you can also just go to our website on aira.africa and find out more about what we do in terms of digital rights in the continent. Other than that, thank you so much and have a good and wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, team.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone, bye.